Hello, my name is John Didi, professor of political science at the community colleges of Baltimore County and local media political analyst. Welcome to the Maryland State Politics and Government podcast on Substack. Today I'm talking with Senator Justin Reedy from Carroll County. How's everything going in Annapolis?
Well, it's been a busy start to the session. Feels like we're in the middle of like crossover week almost with everything going on.
Yeah, lot of stuff hitting the fan slowly and surely. My first question, our focus today on energy policy, is how would you describe Maryland's current energy policy?
I would describe it as short-sighted, not scientific, and not focused on what it should be focused on.
What can be done to improve things related to energy policy? Because right now, it seems like everyone, you're seeing these Facebook pages coming up, anti-BG&E stuff. Everyone's trying to figure out who the bad guy is. And to me, it seems like there may be more than one bad guy.
Well, look, I think the Public Service Commission should have restrained the utilities from adding as much margin into their pricing for things like delivery and infrastructure costs. However, those costs, many of them have been forced upon them by General Assembly and state government mandates over the years that have made them put more money into doing things like climatizing their infrastructure. So it's added cost. So you could blame the utilities for trying to profit, but you also could blame the regulations. There's other things we can get into. And the Public Service Commission has the ability to restrain that. And they're all appointed now by Governor Moore, and they did not in this recent round of increases.
What are the regulations that you look at that drive you crazy, that they basically have to make some changes or do something? Because right now people are getting these energy bills and they don't see it going down.
Well, the climate, some of the things like the climate change, the Climate Now Act from 2022 and then an upgrade in 2023, some of that was about private businesses and government buildings. But there was also a lot that went through then and previously to require these power companies to, number one, get a kind of an extreme percentage of their energy mix has to come from renewables, of which they never hit the target. So they pay fines to RGGI, which is a multi-state organization, and we pay that. So that the ratepayers get that passed on to them. The state also did many years ago this Empower Maryland program, and the idea was we're going to invest in renewable energies. We're going to take people's money and try to come up with ways to grow renewable energy in Maryland and have programs that get people to do more renewable stuff in their house. But largely that's failed. The idea was it would bring down prices and create a competitive market for energy, but it's largely failed, and yet people are being charged on average $21 a month for the Empower fee on their bill. And so people can be upset at the utility, and I'm not, as I said, I'm not going to cape for the utilities. I think there's some things that they can do better as well, and certainly they've been aggressive in seeking as much profit margin as they can, but that's sort of a job of a corporation. A lot of the fees and the things on people's bills, it's not just the delivery of energy. It's these additional regulations, mandates that then get passed on to consumers, or in the case of the Empower fee, the Empower tax directly come out of the bill for a consumer, and they haven't really gone to what the goal was. We haven't seen the kind of things that we were promised. My view is we ought to pause, or we ought to get rid of the Empower program, period, or at the very least pause it. I'm told that of the average $21 that comes out of everyone's bill, not everybody's 21, some are a little more, some are a little less, but on the average it's $21. I'm told that about $4 of that is to pay for things that have already been spent, we got to pay the bill on. But you could very quickly pause about $17 on average of everybody's bill, and that, monthly. the much touted relief bill the governor's put in is only promising another like $40 one-time relief. So if government could stop putting so many things onto people's bills, then our prices would go down somewhat right away. We can get into more to energy. You asked about energy policy, though, so we can certainly get into more of the policy of why we've ended up where our energy that we get delivered is so expensive too. But those are some things that government regulations they've put in place. And it isn't, when people hear me talk about something like climate change or climate requirements, if you're someone listening to your podcast that's more on the liberal side or believes that climate change is more of a threat to our immediate survival than I do, I don't think the science shows that. I think the science shows that we have, changes in temperature. We have changes in global climates that fluctuate. We do want to reduce emissions and things of that nature, and have cleaner air, and all of those things are important. But we also know that one little state makes almost no difference in a lot of that. And what we're doing is going to the extreme of acting as if the regulations for how they require some of this infrastructure to be climatized almost acts as if we're about to have a global tidal wave in the next 5 years, and we've got to shore up for that. I'm just telling you, it's very extreme. And so if those costs then have to get passed on to somebody, and BGE passes them on to consumers, and I'm sure Pepco, BGE, they're profiting some when they pass that on too. But that's a PSC rule to say you can't profit as much. But we could also just ease back some of those regulations. So I hope that's understandable, even if you might be a little bit more liberal on environmental issues. This isn't really about, you got to have a common sense plan for this kind of stuff. And we are just oversubscribed to hyperactive focus on, we got to have whatever it is, we got to be net zero by 2045 carbon emissions. It's just not even realistic. And yet we're structuring all our energy policy around something we can't even reach, and it's punishing our working families right now.
You talked a couple of minutes ago about going into another area to discuss related to this policy, related to energy policy. Would you like to expand upon that? Because I really want to give listeners and people an idea about a lot of this stuff, because they see their bill, but they don't understand the nitty gritty about how we got here and what's going on.
Yeah. So, I mean, the number one, there's a supply, and I've talked about the government regulation adding in cost to your bill. But there's also, first and foremost, the cost of energy is higher in Maryland, higher than in most any other states, just the energy itself, because we have to import 40% of our energy from other states, 40%. And here's why that's happened. And by the way, if Brandon Shores, the massive coal-fired power plant in northern Anne Arundel County, which is privately owned, but the state can force it to keep running, it was supposed to be shut down. Those companies that had that plant and many other companies that had coal plants and even some natural gas plants in Maryland began to divest themselves of those and shut those down. We can get into why that happened separately as well. But if Brandon Shores went offline, which it's supposed to already be offline, but there's a stay order in place to keep it in effect, if and when it goes offline, we would go from importing 40% of our energy to nearly 80% of our energy in peak time. The coal plants like that really run during the peak time of the summers and the winters. That's when they do most of their actual supplying to the grid. So we import 40% of our energy. Why? Over the last many years, probably about a decade, we've lost dozens of power plants run by coal and some with natural gas. We haven't replaced it with anything. Our goal, the state put all of our eggs into like offshore wind and solar as the main focus, not even nuclear, not even developing anything on nuclear. Now folks are coming around in Annapolis to the idea that we've got to do more to get more nuclear generation, but that is years away because you don't just turn around and build one of those in 6 months, So, I'm trying to walk you through over time.
Appreciate.
They made it solar and wind are the only thing we've invested state like ratepayer subsidies and state resources in to speak of. We've geared all of our energy policy around how can we get more solar, more community solar, which is basically everybody on the electric grid paying for people who can't afford solar to get solar. And offshore wind. We've invested tons of time and resources into trying to do offshore wind, which even if we succeeded in getting the offshore wind off of Ocean City, which I'm against, but if we did, it looks like it's not going to happen. It would not run very much power to the grid compared to what you would get from just a conventional coal or even a clean natural gas plant. And it's heavily, they'll say you'll get like a large amount of energy, but it would be dispersed to multiple states, and it would be heavily ratepayer subsidized. It costs 12 times the ratepayer subsidies to do offshore wind versus natural gas. It's five times for solar. Solar is also heavily subsidized, but at least solar, that's maybe you can argue a little bit more reasonable. Offshore wind is just a total boondoggle. It is a total. Wind might be able to work in some places in the Midwest or out in the West. There's wind power across the plains. It's not that you could never use wind, but for this offshore wind it's an ideological focus. So anyway, I say all that to say those are all, even in the best of circumstances, wind and solar are intermittent resources for energy. They are not consistent thermal heat sources, for example. So they're not as reliable. It's not to say solar can be a piece of what we do, solar and battery storage and things of that nature. But every time we talk about energy in Annapolis, for years, it was all about solar, wind, a little bit about things like geothermal and battery storage, which have their place, but they're not the kind of energy sources that are reliable and affordable. And so I believe the focus, you asked me about our energy policy. Our energy policy should be focused first and foremost on affordability and reliability. And you can interchange those two. Obviously, it's got to be reliable. You got to be able to have power. So sometimes the cost may fluctuate a little bit to keep it reliable. But it's got to be reliable. It's got to be affordable. And by the way, if you're concerned about the environment, natural gas, incredibly clean, incredibly cheap compared to these other, and it's not an intermittent source. So we got away from that. So when these power plants were shutting down over the years, the state had no real plan to replace them with anything other than solar and wind. That's all they talked about. So I'll break there because I know I just said a bunch, but the bottom line is, because we can get into why people will say, well, the coal plants were owned by private companies and they closed. We can get into that if you want.
Because a lot of people, when they hear about plants closing, a lot of people assume right away, oh, well, the company just couldn't make it go. Explain the plants closing, because that's the one thing I think that people are most misled by. They just think that, oh, they closed because they just couldn't make enough money or some other thing, but it really wasn't that.
Well, it's interesting too, because on the other end of that, folks on my side of the street, just your average citizens will say, well, Wes Moore closed the power plants. Well, and I have many disagreements with Governor Moore, and he's very much a part of this problem, but Governor Moore himself did not close a power plant. You're right. Private companies closed it. But here's what happened. Back in the late 2010s, this became a fever pitch, and it crested in the early 2020s. And now we have an energy crisis. In the late 2010s, there was a huge push to try to get private by green groups like the Sierra Club to try to get companies to divest themselves of fossil fuel assets to save the planet. And what they did was, not only did they lobby, not only did they publicize things, but they tried to attack these companies. They got shareholders involved to try to say, we're going to give you lower ESG scores on the stock market. Your stock prices are going to take a hit because you have these low equity and social standing scores that they created, this ESG system. So a lot of these companies, they're like, why do I want to put up with the hassle of running these power plants when it's going to cause me to have a lot of flack from 40, 50% of the population, and my stock price is going to suffer? And then also in Maryland, we really were trying to, we took away any real incentive to say, hey, we're going to guarantee you a certain amount of return if you keep investing in power plants here, because we're going all renewables. So companies that want to build a plant or maintain a plant in a place want to know that they can get a certain amount of return on it. So not only did they have the headwinds nationally and the lawsuits from the Sierra Club and that sort of thing, and political pressure, but then they also had the fact that the state was saying, hey, we're moving away from this stuff. We're moving away from this stuff. So of course, when people say, "Oh, it wasn't profitable to run the coal plant anymore," that because you factor all that in, and same with natural gas. And so it's not quite that simple. That's not the only factor, but that is a big reason why we had these plants begin to plan to shut down. And when these coal and natural gas plants shut down, most people in Annapolis took the attitude of, they took the attitude of, well, that's good. We'll replace it with solar. Well, it would take thousands of acres of land of solar to replace one of these big plants. It's not going to replace it. It's not that it can't be a piece to the puzzle. I have solar panels on my house. I'm not against solar as a source for energy, but I can tell you in the wintertime, the way my solar works, I don't get the same rate. I don't get the same, it's obviously different, especially with snow all on top of them. So, anyway, so that's kind of the backstory. And there's probably people who could explain the technical part of it better than I just did. It's essentially the state government, and it's particularly the Democrats who have run Annapolis, because Hogan vetoed some of these like Empower things and stuff, and they just overrode his veto. But on the policy side, but in particular, once Governor Moore took over, it was like pedal to the metal. We're going all green all the time. We're going to electrify everything. But then all of a sudden, we don't have enough energy. We're trying to attract high-tech businesses. We're trying to leave no one behind, according to him. But we don't have the energy sources. So it's a confluence of several things. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of answers to fix it all next month. We've got to make some real strides to try to address this stuff, but a lot of it's going to take time.
One question I have, and we've touched on it a little bit, what is the bugaboo, the antichrist thing with people about natural gas? Because to me, it's effective and you get heated up really quickly.
I don't know. I think the natural gas thing, it's so funny, John. When I was first getting involved in Maryland politics as a young staffer, and then I worked in the state house and senate as a staffer for a few sessions, and then I went off and did other stuff, and then I came back and ran, did my own kind of worked in business and worked in some other political stuff. I ran for state legislature and came back, and the shift at some point happened right in the early 2010s, I feel like, or maybe it was earlier than that. But I remember when I first was involved, they were like, hey, we're going all natural gas to meet our target emissions goals by 2030 or 2025 or 2026. It's funny because now we're in 2026. When it was 2006 or something, or 2007. I'm like, wow, 2026, that's a long way away. But we had these goals we wanted to meet. So they wanted to convert a lot of the coal plants. First, they did scrubbers and stuff to try to clean coal. And then they basically decided they were going to say, we don't really want any new coal plants in our state, but we're going to do natural gas because it's clean. The enviros were all for that. All the environmental groups were for that. Then all of a sudden, something happened. Now, it didn't happen all at once, but by the time I was in the legislature in the early to mid 2010s, all of a sudden it was like, well, that's a fossil fuel. That's a fossil fuel, and that's fracking, and they get it out of the ground and they hurt the environment. It's like, well, yes, it needs to be done environmentally safely, but it's a clean energy source. And I hate to tell people who think fracking and to get natural gas means natural gas isn't good. Wait till you find out how they mine for the minerals to build the solar panels. Okay, it's like you're getting it from somewhere, and it ain't coming from it's not being delivered on a spaceship. Okay, so. But the natural gas thing is, I do believe there's a big part. There's an ideological vanguard of the environmental movement. I don't mean everybody that's super pro-environment or everybody that's involved in the green movement, but there is a hardcore group that really wants people to use less energy, period, and have less and do less. You just never convinced me anything. They would like the economy to slow down. They actually think it's good that people have to turn the thermostats down much lower. There's that philosophy. I'm not saying that's all of them, but that's first of all, that's part of it. So they don't want sources of energy that are available and affordable. That might be a fringe part of it, but it's there. But then a lot of these other folks are just like, well, look, eventually we'll run out of natural gas, and so we have to find other sources of energy. I'm not sure whether we'll run out of natural gas anytime soon or not. I don't think it's on the horizon real soon. I'm all for finding new technologies and new sources of energy, as I mentioned. but we can't make people suffer with astronomical electric bills because Maryland's going to do its part to solve a problem that's 200 years away. You know what I'm saying? But that seems to be what the bugaboo is that natural gas is a fossil fuel and we don't like fossil fuels. And I'm like, I think I like fossil. I like reliable energy, but I'm being very circuitous here, and I apologize, John. But let me say this: what's really funny about the whole natural gas thing also is that we actually hit our emissions goals. Those goals that were set 20 years ago, we basically hit them. We basically hit the goals. There was a certain percentage we were trying to reach, and we essentially reached it. Why did we reach it? Well, because we converted most of our coal stuff to natural gas. So natural gas worked. But now they're like, but that's not good enough. That's not good enough. We have to go further. We have to go further. So we have to get rid of natural gas because it's not, because the way that you get natural gas isn't as clean or something. I don't know. I don't get it because it burns totally clean. It does not pollute the environment. So anyway, I mean, that's a frustrating part of dealing with policymaking in a state that ideologically the General Assembly is much different than me. I'm a pretty conservative guy, but I'm willing to look at what works. That's why I'm like, hey, if we can find ways to do more renewables that aren't astronomically subsidized by ratepayers, I'm all for it. But we can't just say we're not going to do natural gas anymore. It's just crazy.
My next question is something you've discussed recently, and that is regarding getting away and getting rid of the emissions tests that are done on your cars. And I want you to kind of explain, because at first it sounds like, oh, this is the worst thing in the world. Oh, we should be testing these cars all the time for pollutants. Explain your position, explain what your legislation wants to do.
John, repeat that one time. I'm sorry.
No problem. You have talked a lot about doing away with the emissions test for cars.
Oh, yeah.
MVA. And I kind of want you to, because at first, as I said, a lot of people think, oh, that's the worst thing in the world. It's all, we're testing to make sure cars don't pollute. But I want you to kind of explain and discuss why maybe it's time to graduate from that program.
Well, and that's it's funny, we were talking about emissions, and this is kind of shifting to a different kind of emissions. But the state since the late 70s has made you go every 2 years if you live in 14 of the 24 counties. If you live in the kind of the I-95 corridor or the 270 corridor out towards Frederick, or if you have a couple of the counties on the Eastern Shore and one county in Southern Maryland, have to do every 2 years, you go get each of your cars emissions tested at a state emissions facility that's a contract employees there mostly, but some state employees. And you have to pay. It used to be it was $14 every 2 years, and they would test your emissions and make sure that you were meeting emission standards in your car. If you had your check engine light or some other kind of mechanical issue, you could fail the test, so you'd have to go get that addressed and come back and take the test again. In the late 70s and the 80s, and probably even stretching into the 90s, I assume, we had some really serious air quality smog problems in Baltimore, D.C., that whole part of the state. There were some legitimate problems. And cars at that time were much dirtier. But since probably the early 2000s, it may have even been sooner than this, but certainly since the early to mid 2000s, cars have started to dramatically change their emissions. So we now do not have a car in the last, I would say, 20 years at least, or maybe 18 to 20 years, that's been produced that doesn't already meet the emission standards that the emissions program requires. So we've been still doing this emissions. It's now kind of a kabuki theater where we show up and we pay our money. And the state was netting money from this. The state nets money. It costs the state about $21 million a year to run the program. And up until last year, the state was making, I think, netting about 20 million. So it was bringing in about 40 and netting about 20. I'm rounding, but give or take. And now what's happened is the state decided last year when they were looking for revenue and looking for money for the Transportation Trust Fund and the General Fund, they said, hey, why don't we just raise this fee? And so they raised it very quietly in the BRFA, the part of the budget where it's the bill that's attached to the budget that reconciles it. Never had a hearing on it, just raised it from $14 to $30. more than doubled it. Now, once every 2 years, $30 even may not seem like that big of a deal. But I object to it because I really kind of objected to it before that, but it wasn't as, wasn't high on my list. I would occasionally have people complain, and I would agree it was kind of a phony program. But now you've doubled it as a strict money grab. So now the state will be profiting once they, if they fully maximize it, the state would end up profiting like it's something like 35, $40 million. It still costs the state 21 million to do it. So it's like a 65 million dollars they bring in, and it cost them about 21 million dollars to run the program. And you're like, what are we doing here? Nobody fails the test anymore. It's an over 90% pass rate statewide on this test. And you only fail it, really. I mean, I'm sure there's an occasional clunker that comes in and fails it that's a 28-year-old car for some reason. But generally, the only reason you fail this emissions test is if you have a check engine light on or some other kind of mechanical problem. And apparently most of the profit we get from it, the projected profits over the next few years, well over half of the profit we get is just from fines and fees that people have to pay extra because they're late or they have to go get something done and then they have to come back and then they pay a fine. It really, it's not something that I loses sleep for someone like you or me that has a job and pretty good jobs and, okay income, or if you're wealthy, certainly. I don't think you or I are wealthy, but people who are working like hand to mouth, living paycheck to paycheck, or people who live a long way from these centers. Some folks live near a center, but many people live, you're driving to get to it. You got to remember to do it. You got multiple cars. It just seemed like this is an idea that's time has come. Let's get rid of this program and give people a little bit of a break. And honestly, you can say, well, the state would quote unquote lose money, but the goal is not supposed to be the state making money. And the state would save at least some operational stuff, because you get, why are we spending $21 million to run a program, even if it's netting money? And I even have a liberal Democratic Senator, Clarence Lamb, who he and I basically never agree. And he's co-sponsoring the bill with me because he said, he's like, look, if we're going to take $30 from people every 2 years to clean the air, to have cleaner air, we ought to go to something that actually cleans the air. So I would just like to get rid of the program. He's more of a, let's find something better to do with that money. But either way, it's like you're taking money from people under false pretenses.
That's something that taxpayers don't like at all.
Nor should they.
Yep. Last question is, I'll kind of give you the floor a little bit on this. Just in a couple minutes, what would you like to see done? What are your final thoughts related to this energy crisis we're having in Maryland?
I think we need, and look, I think there's folks, I've been critical on this interview with you. There's a number of folks on the other side of the aisle from me that we've really had some great conversations. Last year, there was some bills passed that tried to at least get started on some of the reforms. But again, there wasn't the urgency of really getting us focused on how can we incentivize more natural gas production. There was some stuff about nuclear that was positive. We need to go further on how we can guarantee enough return to get more production on energy. And we need to get very serious about taking, at least, if not getting rid of, I would get rid of the Empower program. But why don't we at least pause it? Pause it. Give people relief for the next few months or the next year or two on this while we let the market sort of straighten out on energy. And so I'm seeing some positive interaction with people, and of course, constituents, people who are upset about this. Contact your legislator and say, I know everybody wants you to get mad at BGE, and trust me, we're doing some stuff. We're trying to figure out what we can do on utility side to impact some things. But in fairness to the utilities, a lot of the costs there's a lot of costs that we've made them pass on to you. So I think people contacting their legislators and saying, hey, get serious about getting more reliable, affordable energy in the state. Don't let them tell you, oh, that's why we're doing more solar. That's not going to move the needle that we need right now. And tell them, look, find a way to relieve some of these fees and burdens, at least temporarily. Because I do think there's an openness, and the more that constituents reach out to their delegates, their senators, this is not Congress where people get hundreds and hundreds of emails. When I get 6 or 7 or 8 people contacting me about an issue, that's like, whoa, there's something going on. You know what I mean? Like I get a good number of emails from constituents and contacts, but I'm saying if I have people individually reaching out to me, 7, 8, 9, 10 people on a specific issue, I'm like, it gets my attention. I know that. And so I think the more that people tell legislators, what can you do? Don't just blame the utilities. We can talk about some things, but what can you do? That would really be helpful in trying to move the needle on energy. Because unfortunately, other than something like getting rid of the Empower fee, it's not going to happen overnight. So we got to take action now on both some temporary stuff and then also or some immediate stuff, and then also really trying to get this energy market back on track.
I want to thank you again for your time and the education you gave me. Take care and have a good session.
You too, John. Thank you.